I'll focus essentially on two main issues. First, why SMEs are at the heart of what we're trying to achieve in our shift to quality growth. Why SMEs are at the heart of what we're trying to achieve. Second, what is our approach towards progressivity and towards social spending? We know it'll have to go up, but what's the right approach? How far and how is important as how much, and how doing something immediately. So what's the right approach? And in particular, how do we help low-income Singaporeans on a sustainable basis? And how do we help the broader base of middle-income Singaporeans who are at the core of what we're trying to achieve in a better Singapore as well? So let me start with the first theme, which is on helping our SMEs make this transition, this difficult but important transition. Ms. Jessica Tan, Dr. Teo Ho Pin, Dr. Lil Neo just a while ago had spoken about the criticality of the SME sector and how we've got to make sure that they are able to make this transition. If they can't make the transition, we will not achieve quality growth in Singapore. And I agree with them. We want our SMEs to succeed, and not just for economic reasons, not just because they comprise roughly half our GDP. We also want them to succeed because they are part of the lifeblood of our society. They are part of Singapore, and they contribute to the vibrancy of Singapore, as Mr. S.S. Teo pointed out as well. So we must transform and revitalize our SMEs in this next phase of our development as a country. We are intensifying the restructuring of our economy, but that doesn't just mean intensifying the tightening of foreign worker policy. It's not just intensifying the pain. We are in fact intensifying our support for our SME sector in particular during this transition period. Put simply, of the 5.3 billion three-year transition support program, about two-thirds of the monies are expected to go to our SMEs. And I'll elaborate on this in a short while. About two-thirds, roughly in proportion to their share of employment. Now, first issue which we have to think hard about is the pace of restructuring. About not moving too fast, but also not moving too slowly. Several MPs spoke about this, Ms. Jessica Tan, Mr. Lim Biao Chuan, Mr. Seng Han Tong, Dr. Engineer Lee Bee Wah, and Mr. Inderjit Singh. In fact, many were concerned about the pace with which we are tightening foreign worker policies and what the impact will be on our SMEs. Mrs. Lina Chiam had another view. I think she was disappointed that we were not tightening more significantly and across all sectors. It's an important issue. I agree with Inderjit, for instance, that restructuring is not something to be achieved in 2 or 3 years. But we are not starting from today. We started in 2010. We started in a very determined way in 2010, made clear our directions that we had to grow on the basis of productivity and much less on the basis of manpower growth. We had to do it to sustain wage growth for Singaporeans, and we also had to reduce our reliance on foreign manpower, slow down the growth of foreign manpower. We made clear the directions, and we also made clear that we were not going to turn back. And I made it a point, in fact, in Budget 2011, 1 year after we started this, to emphasize that we will not any longer, as we had done many years in the past, vary our foreign worker levies for cyclical reasons. So you have a slowdown or recession, you lower your foreign worker levies. We made it clear that this is here to stay, and the direction is clear. We have to keep tightening and keep leaning on firms to do more to reduce manpower demand and to invest in productivity. So we started in 2010, and this 3-year transition package is 3 years after 3 years that have already taken place of significant tightening, very significant tightening in levies as well as the reduction in dependency ratios. As I mentioned in the budget speech, to be quite frank, we are making this next set of adjustments in full knowledge of the difficulties that businesses will face. But there is no choice. If we do not achieve momentum in the next 3 years, there's real risk that 3 years from now, we will be in exactly the same position. And both workers and businesses will be worse off. So we have to gain momentum in the next 3 years. There is no choice. And that means giving strong incentive for our businesses, large and small, to reduce dependence on manpower, both by tightening our foreign worker levies, selective cuts in the dependency ratio ceilings, as well as by providing enhanced support for every form of investment in productivity, every form of investment, including training up of the workers and developing new capabilities. So that's what the Quality Growth Program is about, with its 3-year transition support package. Taken together, $5.9 billion over 3 years. Question has come up, will SMEs benefit from this $5.9 billion quality growth package? In fact, as I mentioned in the budget, we intend to flow back to the business sector all the additional revenues we are collecting from foreign worker levies. Specifically, if we take the increases in levies that start from this year, starting from January this year, which actually we announced last year, but include the increases in levies that take place this year, next year, and the year after, this next 3-year period of levy increases, we will flow back to the SME sector more than twice that amount of money. More than twice the cost of the increased levies will be flowed back to the SME sector through the transition support package as well as through the other measures in the Quality Growth Program. Let me explain in turn. Wage credit scheme. And the question came up in the debate. I think a few people asked, well, look, are SMEs going to benefit from the wage credit scheme? And there was another view that the large companies that benefit, maybe we don't need to be supporting them because they would have paid their workers more anyway, and there's some deadweight cost in this. And those are good questions. First, let me make clear that wages will have to be market determined. They have been and they'll have to continue to be market determined. But what is the market? It's not an unchanging market. We've tightened foreign labor policy. It's a tight market. And as long as we keep Singapore competitive, we want to make sure it remains a tight market. And in that market, our businesses and especially our SMEs are going to face wage pressures. Wage pressures will be there in a tight labor market. And that's why we want to help the SMEs see through this period of transition with the wage credit scheme. And at the same time, prevent inflationary pressures that would otherwise result from wage costs having to be passed through into higher consumer prices. Mr. Lim Swee Say spoke about this yesterday. What's the right approach? The right approach to sustaining wage increases beyond the 3 years is to take full advantage of all the government schemes that are on the table. Take full advantage of them. We are making them accessible, we are making them easy to apply for, we are even putting some of them in front of firms. Take full advantage of all the schemes. Wage credit scheme, PIC bonuses, of course the corporate tax rebates come automatically, and all the other enhanced productivity incentives. Not just investments within the firm, but also expanding abroad. Taken holistically, SMEs will be the largest beneficiaries of the Quality Growth Program because we've designed it that way. Wage credit scheme, 2/3 of Singaporean employees who earn less than $4,000 are in fact employed by our SMEs. So that's where the core of the workforce below 4,000 is. I looked at the data, having heard some of the questions. We don't have data yet for 2012 that's disaggregated in great detail, but for 2011 we have the data, and it gives some indication. SMEs are paying their share of wage increases. In 2011, more than half of our SMEs gave wage increments, and amongst those that gave wage increments, the average or the median wage increment was over $200. And that is for the very small SMEs, those with say 50 employees or so. Median wage increment of $200 for that group of employees whose pay is below $4,000. So they are already paying wage increases, and with a tightening labor market, as I mentioned, the wage pressures will be there and will in fact rise. So we can expect SMEs to have their full share of the wage credit scheme. Should we have designed the scheme only for SMEs and left out large companies? It's a meaningful question. In principle, larger companies, you'd expect larger companies to have the means to improve productivity on their own and to share productivity gains with their workers. In practice, very hard to draw the line. How, for instance, do we distinguish between a company that is small, small number of employees, but in fact highly profitable, and has no problem sharing gains with its workers, compared to a larger enterprise, which may be in a sector with very thin margins, for whom the wage credit scheme can be very helpful in allowing them to free up resources to invest in productivity and also to share the gains with workers. Very hard in practice to say who deserves it more than someone else. And it's not simply small against large. It varies widely according to sector, and even for companies of the same size, it varies widely. So much better to be clean about this. Our basic motivation is to flow additional foreign worker levies back to the businesses, but flow it back in the right way, not flow it back indiscriminately. And the right way means flow it back in ways that support productivity and productivity gain sharing with workers. Other components of the Quality Growth Program, SMEs were also foremost on our mind when we designed them. Corporate tax rebate. We decided the 30% corporate tax rebate is higher than we've done before. And we decided to do that, but to impose a cap at $30,000. Because the higher the percentage rebate, the more the SMEs benefit. The higher the dollar cap, the more the large companies benefit. So 30% for 3 years. SMEs would receive an estimated 90% of the total amount of the corporate tax rebate. PIC bonus. I won't go through all the details, but we designed it in a way that, frankly, the $5,000 per year or $15,000 over 3 years is not a large sum for the large companies. But for the SMEs, including micro SMEs, it is very meaningful. And for the PIC bonus too, we estimate that the SMEs will receive about 95% of the PIC bonus. It was not designed for large companies. The other enhancement schemes, the $500 million worth of enhanced productivity schemes on top of what we are already doing. Again, they were designed for SMEs. Industry collaborations, linking up large firms, not just MNCs, but large local enterprises with SMEs, up and down the supply chain. Very meaningful scheme to share expertise, develop best practices, and even to have technology innovation in the SMEs. Developing or helping SMEs to strengthen their brands, helping them to expand abroad. That 500 million is very meaningful schemes, which MTI will be talking about in its COS. How can we help the SMEs recruit people, recruit Singaporeans, including those who have been economically inactive? Very important issue, and there were very useful suggestions from members during the 2.5 days. Ms. Fu Mi Ha and Ms. Mary Liu mentioned the PAP Women's Wing recent proposal to give a special back-to-work employment credit for women who are returning, to help the employers hire the women who are returning to the workforce. And you gave an example of giving a credit for 1 year, but those are details. Mr. Gerald Griam mentioned a new hire wage credit scheme, somewhat similar in concept, 1/4 of the first 6 months of salary of a new hire, longer period for the next 3 years. I think Gerald can become an honorary member of the PAP Women's Wing. Honorary. Jessica, another very interesting proposal on training subsidies for PNEs, very important group, not economically active, but some of them lost their jobs or dislocated temporarily, help them to come back in. Every form of training subsidy, including helping them get jobs in Singapore with companies that can use them abroad in their operations, because companies are very short of Singaporeans abroad. Mr. Liang Eng Hua, another suggestion which went back to what we did during the crisis in 2009, EDB and MAS, where we helped companies pay for the salaries of reskilled PME workers. These are all ideas which we can consider. Some, in fact, have been tried before. We introduced the People for Jobs traineeship program in 2001, more than 10 years ago, to encourage employers to hire older workers. We terminated it, and I'll explain why. First, the program provided wage support to employers for hiring unemployed mature workers. In fact, somewhat similar to the new hire scheme and other proposals that were mentioned. We discontinued it after 3 years because there were very low retention rates of the workers that had been hired on the basis of this initial wage subsidy. Doesn't mean it won't work again, but this has been a problem that many countries face in what they call active labor market policy, where you provide a subsidy initially and you hope it works out and the person will stay and the employer also wants the person to be part of the team. So I just say that this is a scheme we've tried out before, but we'll continue to study. But we have other schemes that we have since introduced, which are quite significant. Special employment credit, as you all know, very significant. 8% of the pay of our older workers is paid for by the government. Very strong incentive for employers to go out and look for older Singaporeans who can work part-time or full-time and give them a meaningful and fulfilling job. The Place and Train scheme that WDA runs, Place and Train program, which helps job seekers to reskill themselves, first get hired by an employer, then go for structured training paid for by the government, very heavily subsidized by the government. Another very useful scheme. The Advantage scheme to help firms to redesign jobs. Some sectoral schemes, like Spring is working with the F&B industry to develop a part-time pool of manpower that they can then tap on. Flexi Works, which many of you are aware of, which gives employers 80% support to help them put in place flexible work arrangements. Some members spoke very passionately about this, and I know people like Irene Ng have been talking about this since 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And others made a very strong point about this. If you want to attract the economically active, particularly people who've got family responsibilities, we must have much more flexible work arrangements. We have to be very serious about this. And MOM will be talking about how it's going to enhance a whole range of schemes. Many of the things are covered already. We are going to make some enhancements to help our companies, and especially our SMEs, attract and retain Singaporeans, and to help the Singaporeans to have a meaningful job, part-time or full-time. Productivity has been weak. Last year it was miserable, minus 2.6%. That's the preliminary data. One reason is cyclical, because we're in a very unusual situation where we had very slow economic growth, but in a very tight labor market. Quite an unusual situation. And in that situation, firms don't shed workers. They don't retrench workers. They'd rather not lay off workers because they're not sure they'll be able to get them back. So firms keep workers despite the slowdown in the economy. And that was part of the reason in both manufacturing and services. But it also reflects a broader point that there is a gestation period, as many acknowledged. There is a gestation period before productivity schemes can take off, before firms can customize the schemes that are available to their own needs and can actually think through what is in their business interests. There is a gestation. We started tightening foreign labor policy, we provided generous schemes, but there is a gestation which all countries face in the restructuring process. It takes a while before firms respond. The pain has to be enough, and the gain has to be quite clear. And I think we now have both in place. We have been careful not to disburse grants from the National Productivity Fund and the other sources too quickly, before firms are ready. These are tax monies, they have to be used well. We've taken pains to develop with the industry by industry, deep dives and developing roadmaps for the future, with clear milestones as to what should be achieved, and with funds being disbursed at each milestone. And in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more traction, a lot more takeoff, because many of the roadmaps have now been developed and they're ready to roll. Take construction, which was raised by Engineer Lee Bee-Wah and Mr. Jarul Giam, in fact, is a good example. Good example because they've had poor productivity performance, but we've in fact been spending time with the industry to develop the roadmap forward, going forward. What does it involve? First, of course, the obvious parts on foreign worker policy, controlling the supply of foreign workers and also trying to manage the demand for foreign workers. Second, imposing regulatory requirements. In this year's budget, we're taking a significant move. The mandatory requirements, buildability standards, constructability standards, basically mandating manpower-saving techniques. Thirdly, we're providing very strong incentives, not just disincentives, but incentives for companies to adopt technology and to develop manpower and capability, including scholarship schemes for locals to join the sector. We've got a set of targets. It varies depending on which component of the construction sector you're talking about. But I'll give you a few examples so you know that basically what this involves, what working industry by industry involves. Adoption of dry walls. Dry walls can be built about 2.5 times faster than brick walls. Currently, adoption of dry walls in our local industry, if you take condominium projects, is relatively low by advanced country standards. About 1/3 to at most 40% of our local condo projects involve dry walls. In Japan, it is the norm. By 2020, we expect at least 70% of our local condo projects to be using dry walls. And HDB too is piloting the use of dry walls in its new projects. Another example, system formwork, which is a prefabrication mold used for wet concrete work. It's employed in just 25% of our projects today. In Japan, it is around 80%. Here too, we expect adoption of system formwork to go up to 40% by 2016 and 80% by 2020. So we've set aside monies in the Construction Productivity and Capability Fund, the 250 million that has been mentioned, but we haven't disbursed a lot. We've committed $85 million to ongoing projects, and there will be a lot more disbursed over the next few years as we start implementing the roadmap. And as the MYE eligibility, the tightening of the MYE, man-year entitlement, kicks in, because it kicks in only for new projects, which Engineer Lee Bee-Wah spoke about. 45% reduction in MYE, not much effect so far because it's just the new projects that are affected. So some tightening, but much stronger support and mandated requirements. By the end of this decade, we will see a different construction sector. Let me now move on to the second major theme, which is our approach to progressivity and social spending. Many MPs, I think the tone of the debate was one of supporting a move towards greater progressivity. And many MPs, Mr. Vikram Nair, Mr. Chris D'Souza, Mr. Ong Teng Koon, Mr. Bayam King, Dr. Amy Kaur, Denise Phua, had thoughtful things to say about this direction. They differed in their views as to how far to go, how quickly to go, but they felt this was an important issue for us at this stage as we make this transition in our evolution as a society and not just an economy. First, we do have a highly progressive system of taxes and benefits that is designed to be equitable as well as efficient. In other words, it's got to support economic dynamism. Let me start by explaining, I'll take you through this briefly because it's very important to understand how the whole system adds up. First, income tax. We know that the low and middle income group, most do not pay income tax because slightly over 55% of Singaporeans don't pay income tax. But the other important part of income tax that's worth emphasizing, that it's not just a schedule that goes from 0 to 20% marginal rates. It's also a schedule that extends backwards from 0 to minus 30% because of workfare. And I'm leaving out the other schemes, but workfare is a negative income tax. If you work and you're lower income, you get workfare. It's a credit to you and is a negative income tax. So our true income tax schedule is actually from minus 30% to plus 20%. Minus 30% effective tax rate. For the very high income earners, it comes close to 19 or close to 20% effective tax rate. That's our true income tax schedule. It's 50 percentage points. Highly progressive. And if you look at the chart I'll show, on the proportion paid by the higher income group, basically that if you take it by households, and this is households rather than individuals, right? I should mention that there's some figures that were mentioned in the debate and have been in the press, which there was some misinterpretation of the IRAS data. It refers to individuals, but I think there's some mention of 11% of individuals paying for 80% of all taxes. Actually, it was income taxes, not all taxes. It also referred not to 11% of all income earners, but 11% of people who pay personal income tax. But leave that aside. I'm just saying that to clarify because the figures mentioned in the debate that I'm now clarifying. If you look at households, the top 20% account for 80% of income tax. And that's the way it should be. Secondly, How about other taxes? Not just income taxes, but GST. And GST we've discussed extensively in previous budgets. In itself regressive, but GST together with everything that goes with it, GST plus, is a highly progressive system when you add the whole system together. But let's just add all the other taxes. Besides income tax, if you add all the taxes together, no benefits yet, just taxes. If you take maid levy, car taxes, GST, income taxes, add everything up, still a highly progressive system. The top 10% pays well over a third of total taxes, and the top 20% pays over half of our total taxes. Then add in the benefits, because the true test of the progressivity of a fiscal system is not taxes, but taxes together with benefits. And it's extremely important to understand that. We introduced the GST, we raised the GST together with an enhancement of benefits, and we made clear the connection that this was a fiscal strategy to raise revenues to support the lower and middle income groups. So who gets the benefits? Of course, it's the other way around. The bulk of the benefits are received from those in the lower deciles. I should explain a very interesting quirk in the data, which is why is it that the first decile gets less benefits than the second decile. And in fact, if you go back to the previous chart, you'll also see the first decile pays slightly more taxes than the second decile. This illustrates a point which I hope everyone will understand, which is that these are deciles that we publish regularly in our household income trends and so on, which reflect income from work. But many people in the first decile, indeed in all the lower deciles, but especially the first decile, are not people who are poorly off. May have stopped work for some reason, or may have just, the head of household may have just retired. But 17% of our first decile lives in private properties, 16% owns cars, as of now, 10% employer made. So, they may not be very well off, but they're not poor. So the first decile has many people in there who are not poor, and this explains why they don't get as much benefits as the second decile, and they pay slightly more taxes. I say this because the statistics need to be interpreted with caution when you look at income by decile. But the basic picture is bulk of the taxes paid for by the top two deciles, and the top decile paying its fair share, bulk of the benefits received by the bottom end. And that's the way it should be, and we are going to enhance the progressivity of our system further, as I indicated in the budget. Ms. Sylvia Lim cited an IMF discussion paper, very interesting paper. I was familiar with it, but I had to work hard last night and go and have a look at it again, since you mentioned it. It's a good study. In fact, what economists would call a heroic study, because it attempted to find a link between inequality and growth, which has been a thorny issue in the economic literature. And it reached a tentative conclusion, which Ms. Sylvia Lim pointed out, which is that this study of developing countries found that those that had better equality or less inequality were able to sustain growth for longer periods. And that explained partly why countries in Asia generally were able to sustain growth for longer periods than Latin America, for example. So that was one important conclusion. But what Ms. Lim did not mention was a second equally important conclusion of the study, also right there side by side in its executive summary, which I'll read out because it's a very interesting, a very important conclusion, equally important conclusion. First conclusion was that less inequality tends to be associated with longer periods of growth. Second conclusion, however, which I'll read out, is, I quote, "The immediate role for policy, however, is less clear. Increased inequality may shorten growth duration, but poorly designed efforts to lower inequality could grossly distort incentives and thereby undermine growth, hurting even the poor. There nevertheless may be some win-win policies, such as better targeted subsidies, improvements in economic opportunities for the poor, and active labor market policies that promote employment." This is indeed the type of thinking that instructs our approach. I mean, not because it was an IMF discussion paper. This is in fact what we've been thinking of for some time. We study very carefully what is happening in other countries, and we learn from our own experience. It's the type of thinking that inspires our approach. We are not going for progressivity or redistribution for its own sake. We are designing and implementing policies that stand the best chance of sustaining economic dynamism and building a society that all Singaporeans can truly benefit from. That's the end objective, and we've got to keep that firmly in mind. The litmus test is not how progressive a fiscal system looks. That's not the litmus test. The litmus test is whether it will truly help lower and middle income Singaporeans to have better lives. And that is not a question with straightforward answers in tax policy, in spending policy. And we have to think very hard about those issues. Let me therefore make 4 points that start from that premise. First, when we think about the adjustments we have to make in taxes, we have to think hard about what they mean first for equity and fairness. That's important. What do our taxes mean for equity and fairness? But we also have to think about what they mean for economic dynamism. Dynamism that is needed to support our lower and middle income Singaporeans. That's my first point. Likewise, secondly, for spending. It's not just about spending more, but spending better in achieving our objectives. It's not just about how much we spend, but how we spend. How can we go about it in a way that helps people to stand on their own feet, especially, and that targets benefits at those who need it the most. And in our context too, as I mentioned in the budget speech, and many MPs have mentioned, we have to pay special recognition to the situation of our older Singaporeans, the pioneer generation. So thinking about spending involves targeting. It involves also how we do and not just how much we do. That's the second point. Third point, the government has to work with the community. It's not just about what's in the budget. We have to work with the community in a way that strengthens our VWOs and civic organizations, not just to achieve many helping hands, but to achieve stronger helping hands on the ground. And one reason why Minister Chan Chun Sing has initiated the initiative to have SS, social service officers on the ground, is to strengthen the helping hands on the ground. Coordinate better, integrate better, work better across government, but also work better amongst the FSEs and the voluntary organizations, which is a good point that Faisal Manap made. Strengthen the FSEs. Fourth point, we have to design policies that can be sustained not just for 1 or 2 electoral terms, but for many years after. Fundamental point. So those are 4 points which start from that premise, that it's not progressivity for its own sake, but progressivity that will help to uplift lower and middle income Singaporeans on a sustainable basis. And we think very hard about these issues. We also study what's happening elsewhere, and there are numerous examples of how you get paradoxical results. Many examples. I'll just give you 2 examples. If you look at many of the advanced countries like the United States, good example, the United States. They've been, since the 70s, they've had very significantly enhanced income transfers to the poor, defined in different ways. Single mothers, low-income families, sometimes neighborhood support, many forms of enhanced transfers to the poor. But the poor neighborhoods have not got better, they have got worse. And many more families are disintegrating. Not efficient and also not very fair. Second, unfunded public pension fund liabilities and unfunded commitments to retirees. US is a classic example, Europe even worse example. Not just a problem for budgets, but actually highly regressive, highly inequitable. If you look at what's happening in the US state pension funds, public pension funds at the state level, highly regressive, because they provided year after year, electoral term after electoral term, enhanced commitments and promises, which they now have to keep to retirees who are now going to retire as well as those who have already retired. They can't meet the budget, so current workers have to pay. They're cutting salaries, they're cutting jobs, and they're also cutting the future promises for current workers. Highly regressive, because actually the current generation of retirees are generally on average better off than the current generation of workers. An example of what looked good, looked progressive, but actually was bad not just from a financial sustainability point of view, but just unfair. So these are just 2 examples. Spending better is as important and more important than how much you spend. And do it with a view to fairness and with a view to efficiency. We will do more in social spending. We've indicated our priorities. And we are doing more especially in the areas that meet our objectives of preserving a dynamic society. Education, housing, work support, and providing some economic security to our retirees, especially the current generation. We're not starting from a state of despair. As Dr. Cha Shi Lu just mentioned, it does mean something that the ERU, in a study of a whole range of countries internationally, had Singapore placed number 6 as the best place to be born next year. Many indicators, you can question some of them, but these are objective indicators. Number 6 in the world. And Dr. Cha also mentioned in healthcare, the latest Bloomberg index of healthcare, of healthiness. Very large number of countries, I think 100 and something countries. I had it here myself. Very large number of countries. Singapore was number 1. Number 1 in the world for healthiness. They had 16 indicators of healthiness, risk indicators and other objective indicators. Education, we know how we are ranked. World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report, 3rd best education system, and regularly the PISA and TIMSS reports. Not just because we have top students who do well, but because we have what they call resilient students, that our students from lower socio-economic backgrounds do better than expected compared to the way it is in other countries. So it's quality across the board. That's education. So we're not starting from a position of despair, but we want to do better. We've set out our priorities and we want to do better. Our social policies will evolve, particularly as our society, as our incomes grow slower, as they grow unequally, and as our society gets older. Let me go on now, therefore, to 2 key priorities with regard to our low-income group. When we think about the low-income group, those who have the toughest time are the bottom 10%. Household income about 1,650. If you include CPF, it's about 1,800. It's tough to survive, particularly for those who have larger families, elderly or children. And we intend to do more to help them. But there are 2 very distinct groups within this lower income segment. Those who are older and those who are younger. And our solutions need to be tailored to their distinct needs. Households who are older, whose head of household are 55 or above, actually account for slightly over half of this group of households in the bottom 10%. Most of the breadwinners, in fact 6 out of 10 of the breadwinners, had no more than primary education. That's the description of the older Singaporean low-income household. And many have seen very little improvement in their pay, especially in real terms, in the last 5 to 10 years. We know that. Younger group, very different. If you look at the group aged below 35, there are some in that bottom 10% as well, but it's a very small group. Very small proportion of the young and very small proportion of the bottom 10% nationally of households. But very different in description. Benefited from a vastly improved education system. Almost all with at least secondary education, and many with ITE or something further. So they are at the early stage of their careers, and the way we think about them and how we want to help them with regard to work, skills, home, is different. For older workers, we have to enable them to have the dignity of work. We have to think about workplace design to suit their needs, and we have to provide them with greater economic security in their retirement years. For our younger workers, we have to provide every opportunity for them to climb the ladder of skills, better jobs, better pay. Every opportunity for them to do that, and find every way for their children to do well, starting early in life and through their school years. Let me start with older workers. Mr. David Ong, Mr. Heng Chiao, and several others spoke at length about their needs and how we need to pay more attention to them. What's our approach? These are people who are already well into their careers, well into their 50s. some 60s. First, we will supplement their pay using workfare, and we've enhanced it now. It's almost 30% for the older workers who are low paid, almost 30% supplement to pay through workfare. Second, we're helping the employers to hire them through the 8% special employment credit. And if you take it together for someone who's earning, let's say, $1,000, a low-income worker, if you take the workfare and the special employment credit together, it means that we are paying about 40% on top of what the employer would have paid. That's a very substantial top-up by the government. Then, workfare training scheme. Mr. Ang Hin Kee, very familiar with this, because he used to run E2I. Mr. Ong Teng Kun and several others spoke about this. Even our older workers are benefiting from the workfare training scheme, and we have to find every way of tailoring it to their needs. No one is too old to learn and to do better on the job and to take on responsibility. We have many examples, and we are very serious about this. So far, 1 in 5 older workers, those aged above 50, have been taking part in training, and we want to up that ratio. And MOM will be discussing this in its COS as well. Next, the progressive wage model, which Mr. Lim Swee Say and his colleagues amongst the Labour MPs spoke about. How do we give them the maximum upside whilst minimizing the downside, as we say put it? And that's a very important point, because for our older workers, the downside comes easily. The downside of losing your job, because they are most vulnerable, they have the least education, and it is very easy for employers to discriminate against older workers if they want to, even on what appears to be the basis of merit. So, maximize the upside and minimize the downside, as Mr. Lim Swee Say says. Progressive wage model. We are putting resources into it. We are helping the companies together, putting the inclusive growth program together with it, and we are going to find a way of raising their pay, particularly in cleaning, security, and we are working industry by industry. Next, redesign the workplace. I won't elaborate on this because many MPs have spoken about it, including just a short while ago, Ms. Loh Yen Ling. And MOM will take up their suggestions for job redesign and how we can enhance our schemes. That's workplace related. The home was always a key pillar of our social support for that generation of Singaporeans. 83% of those aged 55 and above who are in that bottom decile are homeowners, proud homeowners, 83%. Most have paid off their loans, and for those who own a 3-room flat, if they're moving to a studio apartment, they can realize on a net basis, after paying for the studio apartment, housing equity worth $200,000. And on top of that, we are giving them a silver housing bonus of $20,000 as an incentive. So the home is very important, and helping them to monetize the home, unlock the value so they can have a better retirement years is extremely important. Finally, the healthcare financing review, which I'm not going to discuss in detail, but that generation of older Singaporeans is foremost in our minds. And Minister Gan Kim Yong will be talking about this in the COS. Younger group of low-wage Singaporeans, different set of strategies. Provide the best education and the best opportunities for upgrading. Provide every leg up rather than a handout. Social mobility is a key feature of our policies, and MPs across the board supported the strategies we are taking, including what we want to do to enhance the preschool sector, most MPs. Provide them beyond the preschool and school years in the workplace with a ladder for continuous advancement. We have to be a continuous meritocracy, not a meritocracy based on what happens when you left school or a tertiary institution. We have to be a continuous meritocracy, constant opportunities to upgrade, to switch line, to pick up new skills, to develop real mastery. And I think we can do it. We have the resources, we can work together closely on a tripartite basis, we can do this. Next, housing. It was very important for the older generation, but still a key pillar of our social support network for the younger generation of low-wage workers. You know the schemes, additional housing grant, additional CPF housing grant, and the special CPF housing grant, which we introduced 2 years ago, 40,000 and 20,000 respectively, tailored to the needs of the low-income Singaporean. I just checked the data recently. Since we introduced it 2 years ago, 1,100 low-income households have taken advantage of the special housing grant. 1,100. For those who have incomes below 1,005, which is very low incomes, they're eligible for a two-room flat. And in fact, 1/3 of those who obtained two-room flats using the special housing grant had incomes of $1,000 or less, which is something that initially people find surprising. How can someone with $1,000 or slightly less even obtain a flat? It's because of the special housing grant and additional housing grant. But why do we want to help them this way? For this group, surviving is tough. Why do we want to help them this way? First, it allows them to have more disposable income because they pay for the two-room flat entirely or almost entirely, in fact, in almost all cases entirely, using the CPF. It gives them the incentive to stay in a job. We will support them in staying in a job, and they pay off the housing. They pay for the housing using their CPF, and they can use their full disposable income, which is not very much, for their other needs. Second, very importantly, it's not just about immediate cash needs, it's about having an asset that will appreciate with inflation and appreciate with progress. So they do not get left out. They don't get left out. And they too will retire with a significant asset for their retirement years. Very important strategy. 8 out of 10 low-income households in Singapore can own their own homes, and there's no other country that comes close to it. The Koreans are closest, another country with an East Asian ethic, roof over the head, very important, and preferably one you own. But no other country comes close to us. 8 out of 10 of low-income households own their own flats. Those who cannot own because they don't have a stable job especially, or there's been family disruption, HDBs subsidize public rental flats. And Mr. Corbyn will of course be discussing all these issues in further detail in the COS. But I'll just clarify very quickly the useful point that Mr. Peng Eng Huat raised about the cliff effect, so to speak, when someone crosses monthly income of $800. In fact, I'd like to reassure him and all members that for existing tenants, the $800 criterion applies to new tenants. For existing tenants, HDB automatically gives a grace period when your income crosses $800. So that's basically our approach to helping the younger group. Work fair once they cross 45, but before that, opportunities to upgrade, helping them own their home, helping their children in school. Every opportunity for a leg up for that younger group. Next, let me move on to my third theme, which is the middle income group of Singaporeans. Expectations have gone up over time, and that's a positive. It's a positive about Singapore society that expectations have gone up. Aspirations have gone up for education, for how well you do in your job, as well as for your standard of living. That's a positive. How do we meet the needs of an aspiring middle income group of Singaporeans? How do we do it? First and foremost, we've got to succeed in quality growth. First and foremost, we've got to provide for income growth for Singaporeans, including especially this middle income group, not just the low income group, including the middle income group. And all our surveys show that that's their main consideration. All our surveys of Singaporeans show good jobs with incomes that can go up and more than cover the cost of living. That's what people's main concern. That's a key priority, and quality growth is not just an economic strategy, but a social strategy. Second, we've got to ensure a level playing field for Singaporeans in terms of job opportunities and progression on the job. Third, make sure they get adequate benefits as well out of our whole fiscal system. But fourth, do so in a way that keeps overall taxes low, particularly for the middle income group. And I'll come to that in a short while. Key strategy, as I mentioned, is to help incomes grow. Fortunately, we've been able to do this so far. Many other countries have had difficulty, including countries that are in the same league as us, as I mentioned in the budget speech, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. We've done much better than them to grow median incomes in the last 5 years, in real terms. We designed the wage credit scheme deliberately to include the middle income group. We extended the wage credit scheme up to pay of $4,000 to help the companies and to help Singaporeans. So that's income growth, and I won't go into it in great detail, in any more detail, because we've covered quality growth. Quality growth is a key social pillar as well, not just an economic strategy. Next, level playing field, and many MPs have spoken about this. We've got to make sure that as more Singapore graduates enter the workforce, diploma and degree holders, make sure that there's a level playing field at the middle and upper levels of our workforce, not just at the lower levels. And that's been a concern. You'll notice that we've been tightening at the middle end. We've tightened especially for the lower end of employment passes, what's called Q1, the Q1 category, and we've tightened for S passes quite significantly to make sure that Singaporeans are not disadvantaged by the presence of foreigners at that level of the workforce. Mr. Liang Ning Hua and Mr. Patrick Tay reflected several very valuable concerns. Mr. Patrick Tay has been talking about this for some time. He's the one who started talking about labour market tests and the variety of labour market tests. We've been studying the proposals. MOM is still studying this very carefully. It's not something that we want to rush, but we want to put in place a system that's fair, sustainable, and allows the companies to stay competitive. But it's a very important issue for us. Our younger PMEs have been able to find jobs quite easily. Our youth unemployment rates are the lowest around, lower even than Korea and Taiwan. Very low. But for our older PMEs, middle age especially once they lose their job, some of them find it tough to get back in. And I believe there's an element of age discrimination that we have to tackle. And they are also vulnerable to the competition from foreigners. So we've got to be quite careful about this. We need to do more to ensure a level playing field, but very importantly, do it in a way that is sustainable. And sustainable means our firms must be able to compete. They must be able to compete. They must have the teams with the right mix of foreigners and locals and foreigners with the right skills and expertise, because that is what allows us to compete internationally. The competition is changing. It's not about China 10 years ago. Low-cost manufacturing is changing dramatically as Chinese cities move up the value chain. Large number of graduates entering the workforce. The competition is changing in the United States. Reshoring is now happening. Very significant advantages that the US has. Lower cost of power because of shale gas. Technology improvements that have allowed them to substitute for manpower. It's not helping their unemployment situation, but it's helping the companies. And they're able to base operations in US on a more competitive basis than the operations even in China in many segments of the industry. The new advancements in technology that Tan Su Shan was talking about, big data, data analytics, transforming not just manufacturing but services, and going to pick up steam in the years ahead. The competition is changing, and we have to make sure our companies can survive and compete, which means having the right mix of locals and foreigners with the skills that we need to create a strong Singapore team, because the real competition is outside. So we are quite determined to ensure a level playing field for Singaporeans, fair to Singaporeans, not just in getting a job, but progression on the job, but make sure it's sustainable and our companies can compete. Next element of how we're helping the middle income group, because I think in the overall budget, it's not something that received a strong emphasis, but actually there was a significant amount of benefits for the middle income group as well, in terms of actual benefits in this year's budget. Special transfers, as well as some of the permanent changes we put in place. I'll just give you an example. Husband and wife in their 40s, middle income, together earning about 6,300, thereabouts, over 6,000. So very distinctly middle income group. Living in 4-room HDB flat, 2 children, 1 in primary, 1 in secondary school, employing a foreign domestic helper. This family, from this year's budget, would save a combination of $530 through the special transfers, as well as $730 through tax savings, both the personal income tax rebate as well as property tax changes which are permanent, and the permanent change in the foreign domestic worker concessionary levy. So when you add it together, it's about $1,500, which also happens to be about the same as the increase in their household expenditure basket, if you measure it using the CPI. about the same. We didn't design it to fully offset the cost of living increases in CPI, but it's a decent sum, $6,500. And they have benefited from other improvements in recent years. The middle income group has benefited from significant improvements in recent years, especially our childcare subsidies, the increase in our tertiary subsidies, including the increase in university bursaries to cover the middle income group, and our healthcare financing changes. Last year we introduced major changes to support the middle income group in community care and home-based care outside the restructured hospitals. And going forward, the middle income group will be a major beneficiary of the healthcare financing review, because the low income group is in fact already heavily subsidized. We can improve it, particularly in giving people a greater sense of whether they qualify for Medifund. But the middle income group is a major beneficiary of the healthcare financing review. I'm not going to go into the initial thinking of the healthcare financing review. Mr. Gan Kim Yong will be covering that, but there were several suggestions that were made in the debate itself, which I can assure MPs we will take up. Mr. Heng Chee Hao about looking at Elder Shield, Dr. Intan, Associate Professor Fatima Latif, Mr. Tin Pei Ling, Ms. Ellen Lee, not yet doctor, I think, all mentioned greater flexibility in the use of MediSave. That's close to the hearts of our residents. It's something which we are studying as well. Ms. Janice Koh mentioned the issue of capping co-payments, particularly for very large expenses. It's an issue which we are studying, how we can give Singaporeans reassurance against very large bills, including the middle income group. Caregivers are very important. And Mr. Chris D'Souza and Ms. Li Lien had spoken about caregivers, including respite care, to give caregivers a chance to rest and recharge. Respite care is an important issue as well. And Minister Gan Kim Yong will be talking about this in the Committee of Supply. Keeping the tax burden low on the middle income group is also part of this strategy. It's not just the benefits we can give out, but keeping the tax burden low. They pay GST, very limited income tax. If you look at those with chargeable income of about $60,000, we've also reduced the income tax rate. They pay income tax, but we reduced income taxes significantly for the middle income group 2 years ago. We kept the top rates unchanged, but we reduced the middle bands. So they've benefited. It's about $650 a year. The foreign domestic worker levy reductions will benefit them. Some also pay taxes for cars. But the overall burden, when you add it together, maid levy, cars, small amount of personal income tax, because it's very low rates for the middle income group, and GST, the overall burden is low by international standards. And we have to keep it low. Keep the burden on the middle income group low. And through our emphasis on our priority to achieve quality growth, and through keeping the tax burden low, we will be able to allow disposable incomes to rise for the middle income group. That's our basic strategy. No country has been able to deliver significant benefits for the middle income group without significant taxes for the middle income group. There's no country that has done so. There are some countries that are in fact more progressive than us, much stronger slant in their transfers towards the lower and the middle income group, but also much higher middle income taxes. There's no country that can raise the revenues that it needs to support not just the low income group, but the middle income group through substantially enhanced benefits by just relying on taxes at the high end. Taxes for the middle income group are the norm in many European countries. The US has somewhat lower taxes than them, higher than us, but the European countries are vastly higher. And that's why the VAT rate, GST equivalent, ranges from about 17% to over 25% in most European countries, including those that have quite admirable social welfare systems, but very high rates of tax on the middle income group. And why their income tax rates also extremely high for the median, not just the top end. Since I'm at it, I'll just mention a figure. Well, I don't have it here, sorry. But I mean, if you look at the lowest tax rates for the median in Europe is Switzerland, something like 10% for the median. But for most of them, it's 20% or higher. Income tax for the median 20% or higher, in addition to VAT rates of 17 to 25%. Very high tax burden on the middle income group. So our strategy is we're going to do more for the middle income group, particularly greater assurance in healthcare financing. We're helping them in home ownership, but main way is to help them grow their incomes and keep taxes low, keep the overall burden of taxes low, even as we unfortunately have to tax cars because of road congestion. Keep the overall burden low. Minimal income tax, try to avoid GST going up, and try to keep the overall burden low in terms of all the other indirect taxes. Let me then move on now to two specific issues. Housing, I will not elaborate because Mr. Kaubunwal will be talking about it, but it's an important concern for our younger middle-income families. House prices have risen faster than incomes, much faster in the last few years, and we are doing something about it. We intend to bring house prices down relative to incomes, not just short-term, but long-term. And Mr. Kaubunwal will be discussing this issue. Cars. Demand for cars has increased. And unlike housing, Lui Tak Yu cannot be Kaubunwan in cars. You cannot ramp up the supply of certificates of entitlement the way we are ramping up supply of housing. We need to manage our vehicle population growth and what we can support in our land constraints. COE prices have been driven by very strong demand and also the slower growing supply of COEs. And that's why we've seen a very sharp spike in COE prices. Last 2 years, including last year, 40 to 60% increase in COE prices. The low interest rates and easy credit has fueled this as well. 100% credit at very low interest rates. And many MPs have been speaking about this, and we've in fact been receiving feedback from Singaporeans for some months on this issue of whether we should in fact tighten the loan restrictions so as to cool the market and not have credit so easily available. A rapid increase in COE premiums poses two types of risks. First, of course, for car buyers themselves. They take on more debt to finance their car purchases, sometimes beyond what is financially prudent. And we all have some very unfortunate stories that we know of young people who've taken loans for cars, although they're not able to service it over time. And it doesn't end in a very nice, way. Second risk, however, is that higher COE prices contribute to a high inflation rate that affects all Singaporeans, affects the broader economy. And this is because COE prices not just jack up the price of the car, but they also shape inflationary expectations and feed generally into inflation. So car prices accounted for 1/5 to 1/2 of CPI inflation in the past 3 years. 1/5 to 1/2 of our total CPI inflation. In 2012, car prices contributed 1 full percentage point, a full 1% of our CPI inflation. So by helping to dampen the demand for motor vehicles, the financing restrictions that MES has introduced aim to help to cool the COE market and to help alleviate overall inflationary pressures in the economy. And this is to the benefit of most Singaporeans. The MES has The last time we introduced these restrictions was in 1995. At that time, the loan restriction was 70%. Loan-to-value ratio was 70%. Maximum loan tenure was 7 years. Unfortunately, it did not have much discernible effect on COEs at that time, and eventually we lifted the restrictions in 2003. This time round, COE prices have risen much more significantly. MES has, unfortunately, therefore, bearing in mind the past experience, had to take much tougher measures to make sure that the financial restrictions are effective. However, the measures are not permanent. They are necessary for now, but depending on market developments, MES will review the loan rules later. Several members, including Ms. Jessica Tan, Mr. Lim Biao Chuan, had concerns about the impact of loan curbs, the new loan rules on families. And as Dr. Intan Azura Mukhtar had specifically mentioned, families with physically disabled members may face difficulties. This is a valid concern. MES has therefore decided to exempt a physically disabled person or his or her caregiver from the loan restrictions for one car. The exemption will take reference from the criteria in existing assistance schemes for the physically disabled. MES will provide details of this exemption soon. Besides this exemption for the physically disabled, it is unfortunately not possible for MES to liberalize further at this point without undermining one of the important reasons for the new loan rules, which is to cool demand and COE prices. But as I mentioned earlier, the new MES rules are not permanent and will be reviewed later depending on market circumstances. Engineer Lee Bee Wah and Mr. Teo Song Seng also flagged the concerns of used car dealers given the unexpected impact of the financing restrictions on the industry. To help used car dealers make adjustments, LTA will give them more time to find buyers for their cars by extending the temporary transfer scheme for used car dealers from the current 9 months to a full year. MES has met with the Singapore Vehicle Traders Association to listen to their feedback and also explain the rationale for the measures. And MES is studying how the depreciation in the value of a used car can be taken into account in determining the OMV for the purpose of applying the appropriate tier within the new loan rules. If you recall, the new loan rules have a 50% and 60% loan-to-value ratio depending on the OMV. And MES will study how the depreciation in the value of used cars can be taken into account when determining the OMV. This is something MES is studying. Other tax issues, very briefly before I conclude. Ms. Sylvia Lim wanted me to clarify what I said in the budget speech about the majority of retirees not being affected by the more progressive property tax structure for owner-occupied residential properties. The government is especially mindful of this group, as I mentioned in the budget speech, and that's why we designed the new property tax schedule for owner-occupied properties to make sure that it only meant a higher property tax for the top 1% of homes, which is about 12,000 homes. These are homes with annual values of above $59,000. And the remaining 99% or 950,000 owner-occupied homes will pay less property tax rather than more. Now, what is $59,000 annual value like? It would cover, in other words, those that are below $59,000 would cover 96% of terrace houses and 85% of semi-detached properties. To be absolutely frank, in designing this scheme, we even studied it geographically to make sure that the places where we knew older Singaporeans were living were properly taken care of. We looked at Serangoon Gardens, we looked at Opera Estate, we looked at Teachers Estate. And I can tell you that at least 90% of even the semi-detached properties in these older estates will not face higher property tax rates as a result of this move. For the small group of retirees who own and live in the top 1% of owner-occupied residential properties, they will be subjected to a higher property tax rate. Even then, the tax increase is modest unless they are at the very high end. For example, a property with annual value of, say, $70,000, centrally located condo, would see property tax going up by just $120 a year. It may be a meaningful sum or significant sum for a retiree, but let me say that in this top 1%, many retirees have other forms of income. They're not earning income from work, but they've got passive income from interest, dividends, and rental. That is the typical profile of people in this top 1%. Fundamentally, this is a matter of equity. It is the right principle that a wealthy retiree should pay more tax than someone who is less well off. For example, a wealthy retiree may own and live in a large bungalow with considerable worth, whereas a middle-income Singaporean may own and live in a smaller home but own an investment property, letting out an investment property for rental. It would be inequitable, particularly since we are raising tax rates for investment properties, it would be inequitable not to tax the wealthiest of those who live in owner-occupied homes. Ms. Sylvia Lim also had an interesting suggestion about taxing properties based on the total value of properties owned by an individual rather than on a per-property basis. Internationally, property tax is on a per-property basis, but in principle, I think your concept is right, that since this is a wealth tax, why not consider taxing based on the value of all the properties owned by an individual? Not a bad idea in principle, but unfortunately very difficult to implement from a practical point of view. to implement based on the individual owner and all his properties, his or her properties, rather than on a per property basis. Properties can be held under the names of different family members or relatives quite easily. And there will also be administrative problems when properties are jointly owned by multiple owners, which is not uncommon. When they're jointly held by multiple owners with no divisible share for each owner. So there are many practical issues, but I think the idea was not a bad one. Let me conclude, Madam Speaker. We are intensifying our efforts both in restructuring our economy, in building an inclusive society, a more inclusive society, so that we can achieve a better Singapore. This is a critical period of transition for Singapore. Or as Ms. Loh Yen Ling says, we are at the inflection point in our history. There is no guarantee that we will succeed. There's no guarantee that any economic or social strategy will succeed. But whether we succeed depends not on incentives and grants and subsidies, depends not on the narrative of incentives, but on the narrative of responsibility and values. Whether we take responsibility together to strengthen the values that matter the most to Singaporeans. That will determine whether we succeed in this important new phase of our national development. The government has a responsibility. We will play an active role in enabling Singaporeans to achieve their fullest potential and enabling them to lead fulfilling lives. The government has a role. Employers have a role, and they should heed the call of MPs over the last 2.5 days to value every worker, the elderly, the women, every worker, and to reshape the workplace to allow every worker to have a fulfilling job. As individuals too, we all have roles. Whatever our vocation, we all have roles. Develop mastery, do better and develop mastery in every vocation. And stay long enough in a vocation to develop mastery. And each of us too have a responsibility in our own ways to contribute to a better community and a better Singapore. So that's what will determine our success in this next phase of development, just like it has done before. It's not about incentives, grants and subsidies. It's about responsibilities and values. And that will determine whether we will transform Singapore by the end of this decade. Madam Speaker, thank you.